Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation to redo my talk. It's titled A Social Hegemony, Control of the Cancer Agenda by Pharma. So a couple of definitions first. So a social hegemony is defined as the consensual submission of the people who are dominated. And we'll be talking about who's doing the dominating and who's doing the submission in a moment. So this agenda that's dominated, what is it? What is the cancer agenda? I had problems thinking what this really is very simply, and I've put these 3 points. First, to understand the biological nature of cancer and its social impact, we need to understand how we work and how we go wrong. Very importantly, and this is really the focus of the talk, to reduce deaths from cancer, which are increasing as the population ages. And obviously, for those people that present with an advanced cancer, we need to provide suitable palliative care. So I have to start, and I'm tempted to give a 30-minute talk about what is cancer, which is more of my thing really, rather than the kind of social sciences or health technology assessment aspects. So what is cancer? So I'll try to give you a simple explanation. So here are 3 pictures, and pictures are worth 1,000 words. Here's a young man in panel A, well, he's 38 years old, who's got a disseminated metastatic melanoma. And you can see that it's all over his torso. It'll be elsewhere as well. It's on his arms as well. This is pretty horrible. It started probably from a primary here in the neck, and it's spread. So this is a tumor which runs out of control of its proliferation and its survival. It continues to survive despite the damage that's been imposed by UV light, for example. We'll talk about this in a moment. And it spreads, it's metastatic. And in B, this is the same man treated with a drug against one of the proteins that's responsible for what's gone wrong here in this cancer, and it's called BRAF. It comes from a gene which has been mutated by sunlight, probably, and is driving the proliferation. And you can see the drug works pretty wonderfully, except only 23 weeks later, after therapy, everything comes back. And you can see it comes back in exactly the same place. And actually, if you look at B, you can see there are some nodes that are still there, and that's probably the primary. So this is pretty horrible. It's metastatic, and obviously I'm afraid to say that after this, he will die of this tumor. It will spread everywhere in his body. So at a cellular level, cancer is really a problem of genetic damage and instability, and the evolution of that instability. So it's complex with multiple genetic lesions. And in the case of melanoma, that would be largely caused by sunlight. So here are the chromosomes on the left here of a normal cell. You can see these nice pairs of chromosomes lining up. And this, I don't think it's from a melanoma, I think it's from a colon cancer. This is a colon cancer, I think. And you can see immediately that there's an extra chromosome 1, there's a loss of chromosome 3, there's chromosome chaos here. There's amplifications of some parts of the chromosome. So all of this has gone wrong. And the interesting question is, how does this cell, with this melange of chromosomal damage, how does it survive and proliferate? And then the other question is, how could this possibly be put right when it's in such a mess? Well, cancers evolve genetically to become heterogeneous. And this is work that's been taking place over quite a long time, but recently in the last 10 years has really been nailed in terms of defining how this happens. So let me just take you through this. So at the bottom of this diagram, below Darwin here, and his picture of how he thought evolution was taking place in species of birds, for example. Here is a cell which undergoes, right at the beginning of this blue bar, a mutation. It has one mutation, and that mutation lasts a while, and then another mutation comes. So down this line here, there's the first mutation and the second, same here. But then another mutation comes, and then another. And then this continues more and more until you get a very complicated tumor, as you see here on the left. The other extreme is some types of tumor which have a first mutation, but then take a long time before something happens and they start to go wrong. So I switched into the next slide rather quickly there. In a normal cell, things are already complicated. So if you think about the chromosomal damage that's taken place, we're talking about damage to an already complicated system. So I just show this picture here at the bottom left. There's in the center here, in this mauve ball, that's a protein. And it's talking to other proteins. You can see how it's all wired up. And that's just one protein in the cell. And there's a massive wiring, how it's all connected to signal within the cell. And this is just one node. And there are thousands of these proteins, all talking to each other. And as I showed in the last slide, when the chromosomes are damaged, for example, one of these proteins here, let's choose any one of them, this one here, doesn't function properly anymore. So all of this has to rewire, and that becomes very complicated. So even in a normal cell, Frank Gannon, who was the head of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, wrote this wonderful editorial saying, as we learn more and more, like this diagram here, about cells, our brains are not capable of comprehending all of the complexity of a normal cell. So imagine how we try to understand the complexity of a tumor cell when it's been completely and randomly rewired. Very difficult. So let's just talk about cancer treatment, because I'm talking about the pharma companies here. So systemic treatment is for advanced cancers. If cancers are localized and haven't evolved too much and haven't metastasized, clearly the surgeon can make a big impact, so can the radiotherapist. But when the tumor is disseminated, as you saw in the case of the melanoma, then it's therapeutic treatment with drugs. So let's take these two examples again of the very complicated tumor with branched evolution progressing, and the other with a one mutation and a long period before anything happens. Well, the good news is there is a sort of tumor, chronic myelogenous leukemia, and it's exactly like, it has one mutation. It's in a protein called ABL, and there's a drug that blocks the activity of that protein called Gleevec, and it provides 80% survival from this leukemia for 10 years, 80% survival of the patients. Now, when this drug was discovered and the molecular basis of this tumor was discovered, everybody thought that we could go much further than chronic myelogenous leukemia and deal with these sorts of tumors that are much more complicated. But the question is, how do you deal, as I've asked before, with multiple genetic changes? There isn't just one change. So how many drugs do you have to give? There are lots of changes here. And it gets even more complicated. And we as a species don't like complex pictures. We like it to be simple, but it's not simple in the case of cancer. So here's this sort of cancer that's branching in evolution and will continue to branch. And if you look at these patients, say this is a cancer of the pancreas, you can see that 3 patients here all have pancreatic cancer, but it's different. It's colored differently in case. And if we take one of these patients here, if you look at that tumor, I think it's this one here, then you see because of this branching evolution, there are lots of cancer cells here with different mutations. There are the blue ones, the mauve ones, the pink ones, the more reddish ones, the yellow ones, the green ones. So there are multiple cells here. This is tumor heterogeneity. It's an extremely heterogeneous tumor. And when it metastasizes, as we saw in the melanoma, this process of mutation continues and it will become even more complicated. So the metastasis will be even more heterogeneous. So this is an incredible challenge to be able to think of treating a tumor like this. Well, because we began to understand the sort of changes that take place in this evolution, the mutations that are in genes, which because they cause cancer, are called oncogenes. And here's one which was found to be amplified, the protein that's driving the cancer, in the 1980s. And Genentech, it's expressed in about 20% of breast cancers. It's called ERB2 or HER2. Genentech very cleverly in the late 80s, 90s, then made an antibody to block the activity of this protein, which is driving cell proliferation. And it's called Herceptin. And this is one of the first types of targeted therapy, targeted to an oncogene, rather like Gleevec was, well, in the same way as Gleevec was. So this was an exciting time at the beginning of 2000s when this was approved for the treatment of breast cancer. And it led the people that were involved in its development, particularly Dennis Slaman here, who was a pathologist who noticed this amplification of this particular protein and its greater activity in 20% of breast cancers. They wrote this article at that time, a very positive article, why not? One can anticipate a post-genomic wave of sophisticated smart drugs to fundamentally change the treatment of all cancers, all cancers. Well, it's great to be positive, but let's look at what the effects of that are. So in Gleevec, we saw that 80% of the people can be alive after 10 years because there's one mutation. What about breast cancer? So here's Herceptin against that protein, and this is a much more complicated tumor, as we've seen in the previous slides. However, after articles by the scientists and by the companies that were involved in its discovery, that was at the time Genentech, now Genentech Roche, the press, of course, says that these are wonder drugs. And here are a group of patients and patient advocates outside the Prime Minister of the UK's residence, number 10 Downing Street, with T-shirts which say, "Need Herceptin straight away," wanting the wonder drug. So a new generation of expensive drugs is revolutionizing, this is the press again, the treatment of cancer, and throwing the National Health Service of the UK into turmoil. Well, why did it go into turmoil? Because when the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, who reviews the clinical data and decides whether or not the National Health Service, the Social Security system, should pay for this drug, reviewed it, they said that it was not valuable in early stage breast cancer and should only be used in late stage breast cancer. Because these people were outside the Prime Minister's residence, and because there was a looming election, the Health Minister, Patricia Hewitt, overruled the experts and said, "We don't accept the opinion of the experts. We're going to pay for this. We're going to generate a fund that pays for drugs that the experts say don't give value for money." And I want to just focus on this particular case for a little bit because it's important, I think. Well, if we look at breast cancer, I've told you it's already complicated, then let me just move this box around. There we are. This is from a paper in Nature Genetics. I've just summarized a little bit of what it says. Incorporation of recurrent copy number changes, that's copies of genes in the chromosomes, deletions, amplifications, generated 1,628 likely driver mutations, things that drive the cancer, 93 cancer genes. I mean, this is an incredibly complex tumor. And to think that Herceptin, and I understand why they want it, is going to make a big difference. It is somewhat naive because it's a very complex cancer. And this is the results of the 10-year trials of Herceptin in breast cancer for those 20% of people who are expressing the protein. And this is the control. And these are either 1 year of treatment or 2 years of treatment. And there's actually no difference between the 1 and the 2. There's no significant statistical difference. Well, there is a difference. They do survive for a bit longer, for about 12 to 18 months. But wonder drug, I think we have to question that a little bit. This is an important palliative treatment, but it's not a cure for breast cancer. So how did this come about that they're lobbying like this? Well, of course, if you've got cancer, and this looks like somebody who's wearing a hat here to hide the fact that she'd had chemotherapy, which she's lost all of her hair. She's obviously, and her family are hoping that something will be done about their advanced cancers. And in this nice article from the London School of Economics by Carlos Novas, he writes about the increasingly important political and economic role that patients are playing in biomedical research. So I told you that they managed to reverse the decision of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. Nice. Why do they do that? Well, obviously it's very difficult for them to be educated about the complexity of this cancer. But another problem is that they're probably in a patient organization. And this is a nice paper from the Department of Sociology at Bath University in the UK, which is looking at how groups of patients like this form patient organizations and how that is funded. And it's funded by the very people who are supplying the drugs for that particular pathology. And I think there's some questions about the role of industry within patient organizations, providing hope for something which may be unattainable. So anyway, to go back to Patricia Hewitt, what they did was they created this fund to pay for drugs, very expensive drugs, which the National Institute of Clinical Excellence had said, we're not going to provide a decent return on investment for the patient or for the health system. So the government, two governments, spent 1.5 billion euros. I think it should be pounds, I think. And the results were only 38% of the people that were entered into this experiment had any overall survival benefit, with a median of 3.1 months at a cost of 1.5 billion. And The Guardian, an English newspaper, ran a big piece on this, saying this could have paid for loads more nurses, for many more doctors. And the article here by Richard Sullivan and colleagues at King's in London says populism doesn't work when you're dealing with complex areas of policy like this. When it was launched, it was not properly monitored. It was politically and intellectually lazy. Well, I understand it, and I think we all have sympathy with these people. But remember, their patient organization is funded by the companies. And the companies would put a lot of pressure on the government to prescribe these so-called wonder drugs. And the patients see all the time this sort of publicity. Here's from Time, How to Cure Cancer. This is quite recent, I think, 2020. Yes, it's now possible, thanks to new cancer dream teams. A cure for lung cancer. Doctors hail incredible breakthrough. Well, you know, if you read that all the time, you maybe believe it. And I remember talking to you about this, that we would anticipate this post-genomic wave of sophisticated smart drugs like Herceptin to fundamentally change the treatment of all cancers. It's very complicated. You wouldn't expect that. And in fact, in 1976, Peter Noel, who was looking at the clonal evolution of cancers, already predicted this sort of evolution and wrote here for human solid malignancies, drug-resistant metastatic, which 1976. Anyway, people don't read the old literature. So chronic myelogenous leukemia, yes, brilliant. And if you look at the scale of, on this slide at the bottom, this is years of survival. Men do a lot better than women. But something like metastatic lung cancer, then you can see that you get a curve rather like Herceptin. And this is just months. Recently, a new drug's been approved for accelerated approval in lung cancer, which provided a progression-free survival of 6.8 months. So what's the impact of all these targeted therapies? Well, I really like this article. It's entitled Hans Christian Andersen, you know, the guy who wrote all the fairy tales, and the value of new cancer treatments. And it reviews the literature of some very smart groups who've actually looked at the impact of paying huge amounts for these so-called wonder drugs. So the first thing that the literature has come to conclude is there's no clear relationship between benefit and drug prices. And we'll talk about drug prices in a minute, because these are extremely expensive drugs. The Federal Drug Administration and the EMA is very similar. Approvals in one paper from 2006 to 2016 of 63 drugs for 118 indications in cancer showed only 44% came from clinical trials that met criteria for clinical benefit. That's the European Society of Medical Oncologists and the American Society. So the trials have not been properly done to produce the data that's got these drugs approved. And their conclusion is only a minority of new cancer drugs approved by the US and European regulatory authorities in recent years deliver clinically meaningful benefits. Benefits doesn't mean cure. Benefits, very rarely, benefits is really palliative care, rather like you saw with Herceptin. And there's a negligible effect on overall cancer mortality. There's a small effect in lung cancer, but generally it's negligible. So would one have expected, and this is what I've been punching all the way through, that a single drug target like ERB2 would result in a curative response from a heterogeneous tumor? No, it wouldn't. You know, the scientists obviously are optimistic, the drug companies are optimistic, but the data is there to suggest this is probably very unlikely to happen. So why is it all continued? Well, guess what? It's to do with money, a lot of it. So when Gleevec was found, and then Herceptin in the early 2000s, the pharmaceutical companies who previously hadn't been very involved at all with oncology saw a new opening for themselves and started to drug the oncogenes that were being found by the scientists in many cancers. And you can see between 2010, this is the earnings here, 60 billion in 2010, 2023 is trebled. $187 billion being earned. The graph here, the line here, shows growth. Well, growth is going down, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but they're still doing pretty good. They're making 187, nearly $200 billion a year out of oncology. Why is that being accepted, that they can make so much money with expensive drugs that really don't do very much in many cases? Well, let's look at those people that are actually culpable of being pulled into this system of treatment by drugs with some marginal activity. And one of the problems is academic opinion leaders in oncology earn a lot of money from pharma. And I just copied from the disclosures on a paper published by three major people involved in clinical centers in Europe. Oh, and one in New York, David Hyman. Here's Josep Tabernero's declaration of interest in his oncology practice. He's paid by Array BioPharma, AstraZeneca, Avidity Biobank, and so forth. You can read all the companies. I have to be a bit careful, but I rather liked his profile on Wikipedia, which says, as well as his passion for having a close relationship with his patients, he has a solid scientific profile. He also has a passion to work very closely with the pharmaceutical companies. And my good friend Ian Tannock wrote this editorial in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, suggesting that the pharmaceutical industry is highly effective in purchasing the silence of doctors. Now, the drug industry finds it pretty difficult to make anti-cancer drugs. This shows the failure rate in clinical trials, and oncology is the worst. So for every 100 drugs that they try to put into clinical trial, 95% of them fail and don't get to registration. Don't forget, the ones that are registered, there are questions about their efficacy anyway, the 5%, but 95% fail. So this costs the companies a huge amount of money. The wastage here is enormous. So they throw a lot of money down the toilet in oncology. So how do they make up for it? Well, they make up for it by asking prices for drugs that are very often, this is a couple of years old, much more than $100,000. And many people in the United States are actually bankrupted by their cancer treatment, which is terrible. And there's a scandal about the price of anti-cancer drugs, particularly in the United States. And even in the UK and Europe, these are negotiated with the companies, and that negotiation is not transparent. We don't get to see it. And the health system is paying an awful lot of money for some drugs that don't do very much. So look at the US spending. The US spending doubled, reached 50 billion in 2017. And most of that growth came from drugs launched within the last 5 years. So that's the group of drugs that Hans Christian Andersen and his fairy tales said that their activities is rather questionable. And the clinical trials that led to their registration is questionable in many cases. But, you know, this is a money train. So the nice oncologist here talking to the patients will give this drug in what's called an infusion center in the States. And the drug cost plus 6% to the patient here means that the oncologist, for every $100,000 drug, earns $6,000. So this system isn't going to change when oncologists are making quite a lot of money out of the system. There is pressure to change, both in America and in Europe, but both in America and in Europe, the USA particularly, Big Pharma spends $130 million a year on lobbying. And they're paying people in Congress and the Senate not to change anything in the legislation regarding the pricing of drugs and the prescription and regulation of drugs. This is a complex question because the pharmaceutical companies earn a lot of money for the economy. They employ a lot of people, but I think there are questions to be asked here. So this is the first summary slide. I'm going to say a couple of things after this. So a social hegemony is defined as the consensual submission of the people who are dominated. So I've suggested to you that 75 years of systemic therapies, I didn't go all the way back through the history, have not significantly reduced cancer mortality. And I've said to you that the effectiveness of these systemic treatments is questionable, with minimal effects on survival and marginal efficacy. Cure is largely unobtainable. And I think that's largely due, and many people do, to the genetic heterogeneity and complexity of advanced cancers. Patients, oncologists, hospitals, academics who say these are wonder drugs, the press, funders, policymakers like the EMA, the FDA, submit to the dominance of the pharmaceutical industry for financial and cultural reasons. I think the cultural reason is important. There is a lock-in to the promise of cure by their products. This continues despite the evidence. And this is a very interesting sociological question, which I'm not really competent to answer, but there have been some very nice papers written about lock-in to particular concepts, and the concept of cure is one of them. And I would suggest that a much broader agenda needs to be pursued by policymakers, government and funders, really to attempt to reduce cancer mortality, and not just to provide palliative care. And a portfolio of concrete and well-developed policies, properly resourced, are required for prevention to stop cancers and for early detection. And I want to say something about that. I'm not alone. There is a growing literature, and this is good that it appeared in Nature and the World View page, an editorial from Vinay Prasad, who's an oncologist, saying that better health and social policy would save more lives than sophisticated drugs. And this is a story that's repeated throughout many health problems throughout 100 years. It's health policy rather than sophisticated drugs that's going to solve the problem. Hygiene was the big thing, obviously, in the past. And I would suggest Vinay is an agitator, a real agitator, and he's written a book called Malignant, How Bad Policy and Bad Evidence Harm People with Cancer. And he really takes the companies to the laundry in this book. It's a fantastic book, so I recommend it. So the future, if the chemotherapy and the pharmaceutical industry aren't the answer, then how do we answer? How do we really address the agenda better? Well, I think we need to continue to understand the biological nature and its social impact, but we really need to reduce deaths from cancer. Of course, we need to provide suitable palliative care. And I'm not rubbishing Herceptin and Gleevec's wonderful, but there are questions about some of these drugs. So I think the future for me, very briefly, is that you've seen this evolution of cancers. The thing to do is to find where there's early mutations before this gets too complicated. And I live in France, but here's the UK doing something I think really beats all of the other policies that are coming out of the USA and of Europe. This is a roadmap to the future for early detection and diagnosis, and that is to find the patient before the cancer becomes complicated and use surgery, radiation, and maybe some systemic therapies to prevent the cancer from going any further. But to come back to lock-in, I'll give you my last slide, a wonderful book that I read when I graduated from Ivan Illich, The Limits to Medicine. And he says, now society must develop programs to cope with the irrational desires of its most gifted members. So despite the facts, we continue to approve drugs that have marginal activity. And I think it's time to have a little revolution and to follow the example of Ivan Illich. Okay, thank you very much for listening.